At 8,850 meters, Mount Everest stands the tallest mountain in the world. It is located between Nepal and Tibet, where both people called it "goddess of the sky" or the universe because of its mysterious height and shape. The name Everest came from a British surveyor general who renamed the mountain after his predecessor, George Everest. 24 people had lost their lives before the first successful ascent in 1953 by Sir Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay of Nepal. By 1996, the price per client amounted to about $65,000 with the commercialization of climbing. Our analysis is about the two biggest expeditions launched by Hall and Fisher in April 1996, which resulted into 5 deaths, including the two leaders. No one would have been able to be there if it were not for one man, Rob Hall. He is the pioneer of commercial climbing. Everyone looked up to him, including Fisher, the leader of Mountain Madness. In 1990, Hall climbed all the seven highest peaks in the world, including Everest, after two failures. He had guided 39 people successfully to the summit during the next 4 years. However, in 1995, he failed to take anyone to the summit because of bad weather. Spring 1996 marked a great turning point in the commercial climbing business at Mount Everest. More than 20 expeditions were on a mission to reach the summit of Mount Everest, with only a little group made it up there, and a total of 24 people did not make it back to base camp alive. Two of the teams are being analyzed based on leadership failures and team cohesion. Adventure Consultant led by Rob Hoare and Mountain Madness led by Scott Fisher. The two teams started the journey with a lot of issues, starting from the villages close to base camp. Both teams encountered rough sanitary conditions. Some of them suffered from respiratory and digestive ailments from these conditions. In addition, Fisher had to deal with an unexpected logistical issue. The team's oxygen canister delivery was delayed. Rather than planning the voyage, Fisher spent the whole time solving that issue. The amount and quality of radios within the teams was a big issue as well. Only the guides had radios. Despite of all those setbacks, every single member of the both teams made it to base camp for training. Base camp is where all the preparations are made for the last ascent to the summit. The most important thing leaders need to work on is team spirit and loyalty. However, several of the team members did not feel they could rely on their teammates during difficult times in the trip. The second preparation is acclimatization. After training, several of the members did not acclimatize, but were encouraged to continue anyways. On the day of the last ascent, which is the bid for the summit, the climbers started from base camp and go all the way to the end in a few days. Guy Carter, a guide who had climbed Everest with Hall in the past, described the problem that they had experienced on previous summit attempts. Open quote, "It's very difficult to turn someone around high on the mountain if a client sees that the summit is close and they are dead set on getting there. They are going to laugh in your face and keep going up. The beat started on May 5th and estimated to reach the summit by May 10th. On May 5th, both teams started the ascent to the summit. By nightfall, they reached Camp 1, then started to move to Camp 2 on the next day. During that day, Fisher left his team to escort one sick member, Cross, to base camp. In Hall's team, all the members made it to Camp 2. However, one member was sick, Hansen. He had a frozen larynx and frostbitten toes. One of the biggest warnings was an experienced climber who turned around 1 hour before reaching the summit. He claimed that was due to bad weather conditions. During the climb for Camp 3 on May 8th, Harris got hit on the chest by a falling boulder the size of a TV. One other warning was the IMAX expedition that turned around as well at K3 for the same reason of bad weather condition. However, the teams continue and reach Camp 3, but everybody was exhausted. The next day on the ascent to Camp 4, upon reaching Camp 4, the wind was estimated at 60 miles per hour. The storm stopped around 8 p.m., which gave Hall and Fisher the confidence to head to the summit by midnight. They had 18 hours to go up to the summit and back to Camp 4. Otherwise, they will run out of oxygen. In the middle of the ascent, they realized that the last 500 feet were not roped. It caused a long delay for the teams to reach the summit. Some of the members turned around before Camp 4, however, the rest stayed on track. After reaching the summit, and the leaders, mostly Hall, made sure that everybody was accounted for, the descent started late on May 10th and ended the next morning with the realization that five of those climbers will never return to base camp. Among those climbers were Hall and Fisher. In our analysis, we will elaborate on organizational or individual cultural issues, leadership issues, group or team issues. We will evaluate the leaders and give some recommendation at the end and some course of action to be taken.
I'm going to talk about the organizational or individual cultural issues. Individual cultural issues. So the team was composed of people from various backgrounds and all over the world with different goals and climbing experiences. Eight clients who the adventure consultants recruited to join the 1996 Everest expedition. None of the clients had ever completed a successful Everest ascent, nor had anyone climbed any other peak more than 8,000 meters high. Not everyone spoke English. Guide spoke Russian and only a little bit of English. Some people did not have any experiences in climbing or high altitude. Individuals from various cultures created a team with a blockage of communications and a difference in motivation. Organizational cultural issues. So that the culture that came from different backgrounds formed a vulnerable one, with no cohesion or team spirit. In short, the climbers were not in a one team. I'm going to talk about the leadership issues that created in 1996 Everest climbing. Leaders were seen as a guide and not an official leader. They did not lead by example, pressing past the previously stated turnaround time, focused on reputation and future profits, did not stick to the original plan, and allowed room for persuasion.
Now that we've analyzed the leadership and culture issues, I will be discussing the group and team issues. So, the biggest team issue was that both groups weren't actually a team. According to Hackman, for a team to really work, the team members need to know who each other are. But both Hawes and Fisher's groups were just a bunch of strangers that had been thrown together to climb this very dangerous mountain. Everyone had their own agendas and goals that they wanted to accomplish, and there was no trust or acceptance among them. So it was basically every person for themselves. Another issue was that the authority and roles among the guides and climbers were not clearly specified, and this caused the climbers not to speak up when they should have. For example, the Russian guide Bukreev, he had doubts about the weather, but he didn't feel like he had the authority to say anything. So instead, he downplayed his intuitions and he kept his concerns to himself. Another example is when Fisher was clearly unwell and lagging behind everyone. Nobody questioned him on whether he should keep going or not. In the end, if everyone had just a little bit more trust in each other and better communication among them, maybe there could have been a different outcome, or at least climbing Mount Everest would have been just a little bit easier.
The two leaders we have here are Robert Hall and Scott Fisher. Both of them made very similar mistakes, so we recommend very similar courses of action to both of them and for any team that's looking to summit Mount Everest in the future. The first mistake that they made were they were both worried about the other team and not their own. Fisher was known for being very ambitious and just wanting respect. He was quoted saying, "When accidents happen, I believe it's human error." To go in with this type of mentality is not supportive of anyone or any team that is trying to accomplish one of the greatest feats in the world. What can happen up there can mean death for even the most experienced and accomplished mountaineers. Bukharev even said, "There's no room for mistakes. You need good weather and very good luck. You need qualified guides, professional climbers who know high altitude and the mountain, and clients. You need to screen them carefully. You need people who can carry the responsibility and challenges of high altitude. This isn't Rainier. You have to develop self-resilience in your climbers because you can't hold their hand all the time." Moving into their leadership evaluation and the recommended courses of action based on that stems from this statement by Bukharev. So when we look at Hackman and his 5-factor model to create successful teams, the very first step is to create a real team. Neither Hall nor Fisher screened their clients carefully enough. The Everest expedition was advertised in brochures and they brought along journalists so that they could promote this expedition. These are really not the type of people that you should be advertising to. Putting out a brochure like Hall did, advertising 100% success rate, even though one year he took up 39 people and 95 the next year, there were deep snows and he took no one, is putting out this false advertisement and giving people this false idea that Everest is something easy to climb. So really they're after the money here. They're after that $65,000, which is not a leader. That's someone who is a business person, a money maker, and they are the business. The team was also not considered a real team. The clients had no time due to physical and mental exhaustion that they weren't able to communicate with each other in a way to really grow together and form that bond that's needed for people to go up a mountain together and know that you're going to be taken care of by the people around you. Bukarev was quoted saying, "About the team's overall level of readiness and ability, I had concerns. Part of the people who had no high-altitude assault experience, our practice in training and developing climbers was to build their experience and confidence over a long time, starting with lower-level mountains and graduating them to 8,000ers when they were prepared. Here, I understood, as had been the situation on other commercial expeditions, I had been hired to prepare the mountain for the people, instead of the other way around." This idea of just grabbing all these people that are willing to pay, that have that much disposable income, is not exactly the way that teams should be chosen. As Bukarev said before, clients needed to be screened carefully. You can't just grab any old person off the street who's quote unquote reasonably fit and add them to an Everest expedition. Another mistake the leaders made in this department of creating a real team was bringing friends along. A big responsibility of leadership is to be able to make those tough decisions, and neither Hall nor Cruz could make them. Neither Hall nor Fisher could make them. Fisher was bringing up his friend Cruz because Cruz was paying for most of the funding, even though he had a history of becoming sick at high altitudes. And Hall also brought up one of his friends who should not have been going, and at certain points shouldn't have been allowed to continue, but because he had been so close before, he felt like he needed to go back and try again. The clients all felt alone and kind of lost on this mountain, and both clients from the teams were worried about, can we trust our team? Can I rely on them? What do they think of me? But they were confident in their own abilities. Carricker said that he felt uneasy and uncomfortable with his teammates. "I wasn't sure what to make of fellow clients. They were nothing like the hardcore climbers he usually went with, but they were, quote, nice, decent folks." He also said that for the most part, I attributed my growing unease to the fact that I'd never climbed as a member of such a large group, a group of complete strangers, no less. None of the clients had a strong bond with each other here, and that was the job of Hall and Fisher. They were supposed to create the bond within the teammates, which they couldn't do. They needed team building exercises. The team should have done everything together, eat, sleep. They should have met before, and both teams should have a common language. So not taking people out who are speaking different language, because Bukarev said that he found it difficult to develop relationships with the fellow clients due to his inability to speak fluent English. So it's easier on the mountain to communicate with people when you all speak the same language. It's easier to form that bond. In addition, in climbing, it's really important to have confidence in your partners. One of the quotes from the adventure consultants team says, "In climbing, having confidence in your partners is of no small concern. One climber's actions can affect the welfare of the entire team, but trust in one's partners is a luxury denied to those who sign on as clients on a guided ascent." So we don't think that there's anything wrong with having people pay for the guidance up the mountain. However, we think that maybe a better pricing structure could be having people either pay for a one-on-one expedition up the mountain and limiting this to 5 people. So having a smaller group will enable people to feel more comfortable with Hall and Fisher, to get to know their clients better, to build trust. Another option is to have the people come who already know each other. So if they want to do an expedition, it would be maybe $120,000 to just take one person up. Now, if you can find 5 other people, then we can start to lower the price a little bit so that there's a limit of 5 and the price can go down based on how many people are going. But the teams have come together on their own. They already know each other. They trust each other to some degree, and they are comfortable with climbing the mountain together. A big concern of the clients was that they didn't trust their other teammates. They didn't trust in their teammates' abilities. They didn't care about their teammates. And that is shown by one of the clients from Adventure Consultants quoting, "When it came time for each of us to assess our own abilities and weigh them against the formidable challenges of the world's highest mountain, it sometimes seemed as though half the population at base camp was clinically delusional." So right off the bat, we know that the Adventure Consultants team didn't trust each other. Other problems with leadership included decisions being made for people that from the beginning knew they shouldn't be going up the mountain. Shuing was a very old client of Fisher's, and he couldn't complete the acclimatization exercise, so Fisher took him out again afterwards, which made Bukharov concerned for Fisher because he was already worn out from his logistical problems, and now he's getting more worn out by completing 2 acclimatization exercises when Fisher needed to be ready for the other leaders. So these leaders, Hall and Fisher, needed to be able to make decisions that might hurt one client but will be for the benefit of the team. And they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to make those tough decisions. When it comes to setting a compelling direction, I don't think it was a big problem in this situation. Both of the teams knew what their end goal was, to send Everest. When it comes to enabling structure, this was a problem. Hall had made it very clear that the clients needed to follow his instructions during the ascent, even if it meant turning back before they hit the summit. And he said, "I will tolerate no dissension up there. My word will be absolute law, beyond appeal. If you don't like a particular decision I make, I'd be happy to discuss it with you afterward, but not while we're up on the hill." So Hall, right off the bat, made it very clear that he is the boss and there's no outside input being taken into consideration until they're off the mountain. This was very dangerous and ultimately resulted in not only the death of Hall, but the death of clients and in the death of Fisher. Both Hall and Fisher were unwilling to take advice and insight from different perspectives. They didn't value diversity. They didn't take into account the importance of someone else's point of view. Had they done this, then many of the deaths up there could have been avoided because many of them would have been turned around before they reached the summit, and people would have been able to speak about what they felt in their gut. Many people said they had a gut feeling that something was wrong and they shouldn't be up there. Another problem when it came to supportive context, besides not being able to communicate with the leaders and being scared to talk to them, there were very few radios taken up. Radios were something that were a cheap tool, a relatively cheap tool that could have made all the difference, because even though you plan to have someone as a front, a middle, and a sweep, that doesn't always work out, as we saw on the Mountain Madness team. Fisher had been stuck, he fell behind, he couldn't communicate with the front, and no one could, essentially, on his team. If everyone had a radio, there could have been more communication, you can easily talk to people, and they don't weigh a lot, and they are relatively cheap, so everyone should have had them on both teams. Another problem is that along with this, creating a real team and being able to make tough decisions, when Cruz, Fisher's friend, became ill, Fisher took him back, and he said he did this because he was his friend, but these decisions can't be made when it's sacrificing the well-being of the other teammates. Also, Hansen experienced a frozen larynx and frostbitten toes, but he had put too much into the mountain to quit without giving it everything he's had. So it was known that he may die on this mountain, and Hall should have turned him back before even making the final summit push, but he didn't. He felt bad for him. So neither of them really were able. Finally, the last piece of Hackman's 5-factor model involved expert coaching. And this is something that neither Rob or Fisher took into consideration, because along with not giving the clients enough screening, which there definitely should be more of in future expeditions, expert coaches need to be hired as well. So Hall hired Grom, who had climbed Everest without supplemental oxygen, and Harris, who had never even climbed Mount Everest. Neither of the people were known for their coaching or leadership skills, and Harris had never even climbed the mountain, so it was his first time. And if I was someone who is attempting to summit Mount Everest, one of the biggest challenges this world has to offer, I would want someone who has at least done it once. On the other hand, Fisher hired Beitelman, who had already had a cough, wasn't feeling good at the start, but had summited, and Bukharov, who was a little bit more humble. But the problem with Fisher is his supportive context within his coaching realm was not strong. His other leaders did not feel like they could speak up against him. And Bugarev was quoted saying, "I wanted very much for my feelings to be heard, but it had become increasingly clear to me that Fisher didn't look upon my advice the same way he did Hall's. My voice wasn't as authoritative as I would have liked, so I tried not to be argumentative, choosing instead to downplay my intuitions. This is a problem because when people aren't speaking their concerns and they feel like they're not able to bring those concerns up, they won't be listened to or heard, then they don't bring it up, and many of the mistakes that could have been avoided during this expedition were just due to people not being able to speak up and speak their mind. Other mistakes Fisher made revolving around Hackman's five-factor model was again the ability to make tough decisions. When Cruz became ill, Fisher took him back down the mountain because he was his friend. In addition, Hall was making the same type of choices. He allowed Weathers to continue from Camp 4 to the summit after he went blind in one eye and he lost all depth perception because the boundaries weren't set. These coaches weren't able to make the hard decisions that they needed to be able to make. The biggest mistake out of all the mistakes made was that neither guide chose an exact turnaround time for the summit. Throughout their time together, Hall had stressed how important a very strict turnaround time was that had to be adhered to no matter what, no matter how close they were to the summit. And so many people just kept bypassing it because it wasn't set. A time needed to be set at base camp, or even at the very least before they left Camp 4, so that people have this idea in their minds of when they're going to turn around. If it's set from base camp, from the start of the team, from the formation, then they understand they can prepare themselves for turning around if need be. But since Hall and Fisher were so wishy-washy on the turnaround time, the people didn't take it seriously enough. Hall and Grom summited at 2:30 a.m. when the latest summit time was talked about as 2 o'clock at the latest, and they were up there for 40 minutes. Hansen didn't summit until 4 o'clock, which was hours past the original turnaround times discussed. So all of this creates many different problems, and these people were businessmen. They weren't leaders. I think that the coaches needed to be screened more carefully. The leaders needed to be coming at the expedition from a better place, not just from a monetary motivation, but for a motivation to have the team be successful, to really allow these people to achieve their life's goal and ambition if climbing Mount Everest was it, but they didn't have any of that. They had coaches that had not been on Everest. They didn't create a real team. They didn't bring up clients that were ready for the expedition. Moving into Cousys and Posner's 5 traits of great leaders, these are what we need to look for in the future leaders. So when we look for expert coaches, we need to find people that are honest, competent, forward-looking, and have the ability to inspire others along with intelligence. So a lot of these people weren't completely competent in their ability to guide teams up Mount Everest. Maybe they were able to get there themselves with or without supplemental oxygen, but they weren't competent as leaders. They didn't plan for all of the things that went wrong. Fisher was caught up with many logistical issues when they arrived in Nepal, and on top of it, he didn't account for the fact that he might get stuck somewhere in the middle or lagging way behind, and he only had 3 radios distributed throughout his team for a front-middle sweep, which eventually resulted in a problem because he was very fatigued from making the poor choices he made in the beginning, and he ended up in a place where he didn't have communication with the rest of his team. Another big error was that They didn't think about affixing ropes because they heard that the Montenegrins did that. However, the Montenegrins wasted the 400 meters of their rope on the first 400 meters above Camp 4, and there was none by the summit. The safety procedures that Hall had set out required all the clients to wait for the guides before proceeding beyond the balcony, which is at 8,500 meters, so Carricker couldn't affix the rope even though he was at the top. This is another situation where they needed to be a bit more flexible. They needed to have the ability to be honest and be communicating, willing to take advice from their team, because people were waiting up there for almost an hour or longer so that they could continue on. And it was just a big time waste. People were standing there in the cold, unable to move because Hall was refusing to be questioned, refusing to take input from the other team members. And that brings us into the difference between a manager and a leader. So a leader brings people together, they inspire them to accomplish a common goal, whereas a manager will just manage the resources. So manage the oxygen, manage the people that make it up, manage how they're going to do it, which is kind of what Hall and Fisher did. They were just worried about making it up, collecting their $65,000 and making it down, deciding what they were going to do with that money. They didn't actually really care enough about the people up there to take input from them. They didn't trust any of their clients, even though several of them had climbed 6 of the 7 summits, more than any of the coaches in some cases. So from all of these leadership evaluations and points, we will now discuss more in detail each leader and then specifically recommended courses of action.
Thanks, Serena. Let's keep looking at this. So looking at the leadership evaluations, jump right into Rob Hall. Rob Hall had characteristics of a good leader. He was trustworthy, ambitious, caring, and straightforward. Additionally, if you look at his leadership style, he had a very coaching style leadership, which was paternalistic in nature. He was willing to bring almost anybody up to the mountain that seemed like he was willing to pay him. He bragged as if he could get anybody up the mountain, and that was kind of his motto. Lastly, for his leadership evaluation, if you look at the 5 conflict handling styles, he said he's low concern for self and high concern for others. That's why he was willing to take these unsatisfactory, underprepared teams up in this mountain, because he would care for them and bring them up there and hand carry them. Jumping over to Scott Fisher, with his characteristics that were good, he was competent, independent, and dependable. Looking at his leadership style, it's the same kind of coaching style leadership, but definitely a lot more laissez-faire. His standard for bringing clients up to the mountain was a lot higher. He wasn't unwilling to take someone that he didn't trust up there himself to build that team. And looking at his 5 conflict handling styles, we said he had high concern for self and high concern for others. That's why he had that standards set for people coming up to the mountain, is because he wanted to worry about everybody. Jumping into the recommended course of action into Rob Hall. Hackman said that coaching is about building teamwork, not doing the teamwork. And that was one of Hall's downfalls. We recommend that he sets that higher standard for his team members before he go up the mountain. Make sure everyone's trained, and teams can evolve. They can take that accountability and shift it from themselves to both themselves and collective. Is what you saw in the case study or in the actual incident. The one guy was injured with his eyesight, and everyone just kept walking past him. They had very low care for others. It was all individualistic. They all paid money. They were up there. They wanted to get the most out of their situation, expecting Hall to take care of them. The second recommended course of action was be careful of your biases. Specifically for Hall would be a sunk cost effect. He'd already accepted the money, invested the time in these clients. Doug was so close to getting up top of the mountain, and he took all that into perception and then made that faulty mistake of keep going. We would recommend that he doesn't let those biases come into play. Always clear your judgment and make those decisions as if you're not in that moment but somebody else. And lastly, we had the group think. You feel the high pressure to conform and agree and unwilling to see realistic alternate views. especially the rock ballers are talking with Doug. He was almost there. He was so close. He let Doug saying that I can make it, I can make it. He let him believe that. And so I recommend a course in action is to ensure decision making is based on rational facts and thoughts, not the persuasion of others' biases either, not just your own. Jumping into Scott Fisher, Hackman said create a real team that have stability over time. So our recommended action for him is to build a team more focused on collectivism and individualism, kind of the same thing. He brings people up there. They don't have a real team. They're just there. They're paying. The bias that we think Scott Fisher fell part of was the overconfidence bias, which is a tendency to hold a false or misleading assessment of ourselves. He'd been up there a lot. Thought he knew the mountain. He went all the way back down to base camp, so confident that he could make it to the top and back down again, which ultimately didn't work. For our recommendation is that you listen to others, know your limits, and don't be afraid to cut your losses. Finally, for the 5 conflict handling systems, it's not a bad thing to have high concern for others. We recommend that he delegates care for others if that ends up being an issue on the mountain for anybody else. You want to have high concern for others, you want to care for them, but if there's something happening elsewhere, it shouldn't be your sole responsibility to walk everybody at every point of the mountain. You should be able to delegate and have steps set in stone so that this doesn't happen.